Yeah, and then socialism to communism or whatever. Well, here's the problem with this. Or here's the problem as I see it with this. Social democracy then can never be revolutionary. And there's a really good reason why social democracy can never be revolutionary. Anytime you have a revolution, you are going to have a bunch of negative consequences. Not the least of which, probably at least a few people, if not a mass of people, are going to find themselves with the terminal case of lead poisoning. Right? So social democracy, under a consequentialist ethic, would never become a revolutionary theory as such. And I think this is one of the greatest failings of consequentialism as an ethic and social democracy as a movement, right? As an ethical sort of movement. So again, that'd be social democracy. And I think it's quite clear how that links consequentialism to the practice of social democracy. Essentially, you will never have a reason to believe that a revolution will ever be worth the costs or the risks involved in that consequence in order to, right, abolish capitalism. So, of course, being the good Marxist-Leninist I am, I would dismiss both consequentialism and social democracy as revisionist. Sorry, question.
What about a consequentialist reforming of the values that you were speaking of, the goods, to be something like, economic social justice or something? Could that allow then for a revolution, perhaps?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Actually, I'm gonna get this, and then if you have a question or response, we'll go. We're doing a little different format for those of you who just came in, which is I'm answering questions as we go. Well, here's the thing. Perhaps theoretically, in the incredibly logically abstract. But here's the thing. If you have any sort of revolution that would really constitute any sort of revolution, you're going to have a lot of disutility, almost certainly. Capitalists losing their property, massive dislocation, both economic and political. And it's a problem of epistemology. How do we know what's going to happen with a revolution? Right? A revolution is itself so variable, you could never, I believe, from a consequentialist perspective, adequately judge when essentially things have become so bad that it's worth courting the danger of a revolution itself. Because that would be a massive destabilization. Some notable exceptions. Maybe in Nazi Germany. Maybe in Mussolini's Italy, right? Because things would be so bad that in that case, the disutility or the bad consequences of destabilizing your government and attempting to overthrow it might possibly be greater, right, than the disutility of allowing the regime. But can you see why that would be an incredibly outside possibility? I mean, and if not, feel free to come with an argument.
If I understood you correctly, when you move away from utilitarianism and towards the consequentialism that comes from it, we're not talking about disutility anymore. We're talking about a certain type of goods that are defined. I think what John's question is, why not define those goods differently, like social justice being good rather than pleasure, for instance. Like we're talking about the displeasure that would come from a revolution, but only if you define good consequences as pleasure does that matter.
Well, what I would say to you is this. The actual difficulty is not in what sort of consequences are defined. It's in the notion of a revolution. Because for any consequentialism, it has to have a way of weighing everyone's desires. So, for example, I can have a desire and a set of consequences, but what weighs my set of consequences, my set of values, against, say, Bill Gates, Paris Hilton? Well, for most consequentialists, the only adjudicator in that could possibly be would be a democracy, right? And so again, yeah, if you abstractly define revolution as just a gradual alteration through democratic means, yeah, okay. But when we look at anything that is called a revolution and what that looks like, it never looks anything like that. So yeah, I mean, abstractly, so do you see why it's not a problem of defining terms of goods or values? It's a problem of defining revolution, at least as I see it. I mean, does that make sense?
In addition to that, it seems, I mean, when talking about consequences, it seems to be a huge factor. Like, I agree with you to the extent that predicting consequences is really difficult. When saying that you can't justify a revolution with consequences, because of the reason that you presented is only because you're setting a limit to how far ahead we can. I mean, I would argue that most that are interested in revolution are interested in it because of the consequences that it will bring. But of course, they're going to be within a certain time frame. There's going to be tremendous disutility. It just seems like how far ahead you're looking is like a huge factor in this, from this perspective, from this ethical perspective.
Well, I mean, yeah. Here's the thing, though. Just historically speaking, most consequentialist line of thought as a matter of fact, do not lead to revolutionary action. If you look at the revolutionaries who actually engage in revolution, they're almost never guided by the consequences. What they're guided by, and I'll get into this a little bit later, is a notion of justice, which is pushed essentially on everyone equally, although perhaps imperfectly. But as a matter of fact, those who consider the consequences usually become social democrats and fight for things. For example, what are the likely utilities or consequences of having an armed insurrection that very well could fail or plunge the country into civil war for an unknown amount of years? And what is the likely consequences of fighting for a 50-cent increase in wage? Right? The fight for a 50-cent increase of wage, while not particularly heroic sounding, makes perfect sense. Because, right, the utility of that 50-cent increase can easily be determined. Whereas, right, the consequences of armed insurrection against the government and the likely outcome of that are incredibly obscure, right? I mean, in its prediction. So, I mean, yeah, perhaps again, in a very theoretical way, you could say, oh, well, ironically, capitalists are most critical of socialists who try to justify things in consequentialist terms, right? Oh, just one last thing, right? Most capitalists do not believe in a glorious socialist future. And given, as of now, the outcome of anarchism, of Leninism, of Marxism, of all the other radical philosophies and politics, it seems very unlikely to believe in that glorious, shining future of socialism.
Yeah, and I actually would argue that most utilitarian consequentialist ethics actually are capitalist ethics. If you think about the way people weigh cost-benefit analysis over certain things, and then make judgments from that. And here's another example. I participated in an ethics poll, and the case I had was over West Papua and whether to stop mining. And the opponent I had literally gave this argument. He said, if you look at the economic situation of the mining, yeah, sure, it's deplorable, but in the macro scale of economics of the world, it's applying copper in these various places and giving various benefits to Indonesians. And if you stop that, that's going to cause a greater disutility to more people. And so it's therefore justified that we should continue mining in West Papua, which obviously is exterminating people and destroying the environment. But those harms don't outweigh the benefit of people getting hospitals, et cetera, humanitarian, blah, 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 blah.
Maybe we can talk about this when we get into it, like the virtue of it, but I see justice as a consequence. Like if we're able to, like maybe it's just semantics, or maybe it's maybe it's just semantics. But I see like global justice as a consequence, and so not looking to that as a consequential end. When you talk about that, a second.
Yeah, and if I could, I'll just move into virtue ethics now, or aretaic ethics. Arete, of course, is the Greek word for of good quality, essentially. So aretaic ethics, acts are good or bad relative to the character of the person. Now, this is a little bit of a confusing term.